3:47 a.m. That was the exact time we spent in absolute silence in the Eastern Canyon, 12 kilometers from any Allied support, where the air is so thin that hope dies before the first shot. While the general drank $50 Arabic coffee in a climate-controlled bunker, I felt the warmth of a 19-year-old recruit's blood soaking my sleeve. The official report you read in the newspapers speaks of a coordinated tactical withdrawal maneuver. But what the classified files hide is that my squad's survival wasn't a miracle of military intelligence. It was an act of deliberate insubordination. I had to turn off the radio, ignore direct orders, and become a war criminal to ensure 20 hearts kept beating. The bitter truth that command doesn't want you to know is that, on the battlefield, the bullet that hurts the most usually comes from someone sitting behind a desk wearing the same uniform as you. Listen carefully to what I am about to say now, because this truth almost cost me my life and my name, and I don't know how long this broadcast will remain on the air. If you are the type who doesn't accept official versions and wants to understand what really happens in the shadows, where billion-dollar satellites go blind, join our unit by clicking the subscribe button. Leave a comment if you've ever felt that your worst enemy was sitting next to you in the trench. I'm going to tell you how I crossed the final perimeter, and why what I saw on the other side changed my war forever. Sit here, my son. Closer. The fire is already dying down, and the night chill is beginning to seep through the cracks. But don't worry about the coffee. My fingers no longer have the steadiness to hold the cup without the liquid dancing and overflowing. It's funny, isn't it? I spent my life holding rifles in terrains where the ground shook under my boots. And now the greatest weight I carry is the weight of my own years. This shell of mine, this earthly tabernacle, as the scriptures say, is falling apart. I feel every joint as if it were a rusty hinge of a forgotten bunker. But the mind is a stubborn beast. It takes me back to that bunker, the real one. I can smell the expensive Arabic coffee the general drank while pointing at those colorful maps on the screen. He radiated an arrogance that shone brighter than the metals on his chest. "It's a clean zone, Kfir," he told me, with that voice of someone who has never tasted the dust in their teeth. "In an hour, you'll be back for dinner." I looked at the analog watch on my wrist. Listen to its tick-tock now. Can you hear it? It's the only sound that never abandoned me. That day, the tick-tock echoed in the silence that followed the general's laughter when I pointed out the shadows in the Eastern Canyon. He called my caution museum paranoia. For him, war was a profit chart. For me, it was an obituary I refused to sign. Today, sitting here, I feel I've received a new briefing, but there are no maps on the wall. Only the shadows of my medicines and the silence of the house. I feel I am once again facing an exclusion zone, but this time the general is time, and he does not accept insubordination. It was on a Tuesday afternoon. The sun was coming through the window just like now. I was polishing the glass of my watch, that same one that marked the time the general said we wouldn't have. Suddenly the rhythm changed, not the watches, but my chests. It was a strange friction, a pressure that didn't seem to come from outside but from within, as if the canyon I feared so much was collapsing inside my lungs. I tried to catch my breath, but it was thin, as if I were on top of a mountain in the middle of a combat zone. The radio of my consciousness began to emit only white noise. I gripped the arm of the chair. The cold leather felt for a second like the metal butt of my old rifle. I looked at the photo on the shelf, the boys from my squad. Those 20 hearts I ensured kept beating. My vision began to tremble, like a satellite feed losing signal under heavy fire. The voices in the kitchen, my daughter calling for dinner, began to sound distant, as if they were on the other side of a deep valley covered in mist. I wanted to answer. I wanted to say that the sector wasn't clean, that something was coming. But my tongue felt heavy. The tick-tock of the watch grew louder, slower. Tick-tock. And suddenly, the weight was gone. The chest pain, the joint fatigue, the smell of medicine, everything dissipated like mortar smoke in the wind. I saw my own body there, leaning in the chair, an old and worn-out tent that finally gave in to time. There was no panic, there was only a silent curiosity. I was leaving. I was crossing the perimeter. For the first time in decades, I didn't need to look at the map. I felt my feet leave the firm ground of this world, and, as if I were entering that canyon of shadows the general ridiculed, I took the first step out of life, and the void ahead of me began to glow with a light that no tactical monitor could ever capture. Imagine, my son, the feeling of stripping off a heavy uniform, soaked in mud and sweat, after a march of days through a swamp. Can you visualize it? That relief in your shoulders when the ballistic vest is finally released, and you feel that you can, for the first time in weeks, simply exist. Well, what I felt upon leaving my body in that chair was 1,000 times deeper. It wasn't just the weight of the equipment that fell to the ground that afternoon. It was the weight of gravity itself, the weight of chronic pain, the weight of the bitter memory of all the men I saw fall by my side. The darkness, that mist I saw descending over the room while my daughter called for dinner. It wasn't the end, you see. It was just a veil. On one side, there was the smell of cold coffee and the tired tick-tock of my old analog watch. On the other, an atmosphere I can only describe as presence. The air there had substance. It had a density of love that seemed to sustain every atom of what remained of me. Do you understand? I wasn't falling into a void. I was being supported by something invisible yet terribly real. You know, for decades I trained boys to survive the desert. I taught them to read the stars when billion-dollar satellites went blind. But nothing, no secret briefing in the deepest bunker, could prepare me for the absolute and glorious lightness of that transition. I no longer had inflamed joints. I no longer had that pressure in my chest that stole my breath. I was me, but a me that had never been wounded by war. A me that had never known the general's cynicism or the terror of the ambush. And then came the light. Ah, the light. It wasn't the cold, sterile glow of the central command lamps. This was something alive. It was a clarity that seemed to have a pulse, do you understand? It breathed. It came from a horizon that had no end and enveloped every fiber of my being with a warmth that didn't burn, but healed. It was a light that cast no shadows. How can there be light without shadow, you ask? I didn't know either until that moment. In that place, the light didn't come from an external source. It seemed to be the very essence of everything around me. The sound. At first, it was the most sacred silence I've ever experienced. But make no mistake, it wasn't the hollow silence of an abandoned battlefield, the kind that makes your ears ring with dread. It was the silence of a cathedral before the first organ chord, and gradually this silence was filled by a murmur, like the sound of many waters falling from an infinite height, or perhaps the sound of a crowd singing in a harmony so perfect that the human mind cannot process it. It was as if creation itself were finally letting out a sigh of relief it had kept for millennia. I was moving, my son. Not because I was marching with my old combat boots, but because the light itself attracted me, like a magnet pulling iron filings. I was leaving behind the canyon of shadows. I was leaving behind the need to hide, the fear of being caught in a court-martial, the anguish of being the only one to know the truth about that mission. There, the suicide route that the general so despised was no longer a path of stones, but an avenue of glory. I looked at what I was now. My hands no longer shook. They were firm, made of something that looked like condensed light. The casualty report that the world had left behind now seemed like a meaningless piece of paper, floating in an irrelevant wind. I wasn't a statistic. I wasn't a veteran forgotten in a leather chair. I was a son returning home, marching toward the final encounter. It was at that exact moment, as the music of the waters became a hymn of triumph, and the clarity became so intense that I felt I was going to merge with it, that everything stopped. The movement ceased. The space in front of me began to take a shape, a sacred density. I felt a gaze upon me, A gaze that knew me even before I learned to march. A gaze that saw every bunker, every trench, and every tear I shed in silence. In the center of that overwhelming light, I realized, with a tremor of pure reverence, that I was not crossing the perimeter alone. The light was no longer something I saw with my eyes, my son. It was something that I was. It didn't come from above or from the sides. It emanated from every pore of my renewed being. And in the center of that absolute clarity, my little one, there was no golden throne or a fortified bunker like the generals of this world like to imagine. There was someone. I saw him. Or rather, I felt him with a depth that makes this air we breathe seem thin and false. He wore no medals, but his hands, the hands that came toward me, they had marks. Marks of a much older and more painful war than any I had fought in the desert. When our eyes met, I didn't need to salute. My knees simply gave way. Not out of fear, understand, but because glory has a weight. It's a good weight, like that of a heavy blanket on a harsh winter night. A gravity of pure love that makes us want to disappear into him. There was no sound of words blown by the wind. It was an immediate knowing. Communication there happens from soul to soul, without the lying filter of human tongues. He called me by my name, not my war code name, not the kafir that the soldiers feared and respected, but by the name that only my Creator knows. And in that single silent word, I felt every sin, every shadow of doubt, and every ounce of guilt I carried for decades simply evaporate. You know that weight I told you about? The weight of having disobeyed the general to save my men. The weight of feeling like a criminal for following my heart instead of the radio. There, before him, I saw that such insubordination was, in fact, his voice echoing inside me. He showed me, in a glimpse of eternity, that while the general counted heads and profits, he was counting the heartbeats of each of those 20 boys in the canyon. I cried, my son. I cried tears that were not of pain, but of a deep cleansing. I felt his love washing away the invisible bloodstains I thought would never come off my hands. He showed me a truth that no tactical manual teaches, that true leadership is not about who gives the order, but about who is willing to be the last, so that others may be the first. He showed me that the canyon of shadows was not a trap. It was my altar. Every step I took in the dark, holding the compass with trembling hands, it was he who moved the needle. The peace. The peace. It was as if I had finally come home after a lifetime in enemy territory. I didn't want anything else. I didn't want my watch. I didn't want my memories. I didn't want my name. I just wanted to lose myself in that presence forever. We were there, enveloped in a light that seemed to sing, and I felt I was about to cross the final perimeter, the point of no return. But then, his silence changed tone. It became solemn, like the sounding of taps at sunset, but loaded with a sweetness that broke my heart. Not yet, my faithful soldier, was what I felt vibrating throughout my being. The time of your watch is not yet over. There are hearts that still need to hear the rhythm of your watch. There are stories that only your scars can tell. I tried to resist. Oh, how I tried. I begged with every fiber of my spirit not to have to return to this tired body and to this world of ashes. But his will is like the dawn, irresistible and sovereign. The light began to fade, or rather I began to be pulled back, away from that indescribable warmth. I felt the weight of gravity returning, the smell of medicine and dust, and like a diver rising too fast to the surface, the metal tick-tock of my old analog watch began to pierce the sacred silence. Tick-tock. I opened my eyes. The sun was still hitting the chair. My daughter was still calling from the kitchen, but I would never be the same man who sat there 10 minutes before. I had seen the commander, and he sent me back with one last mission. The return. It wasn't a jump, my son. It was a slow fall through a gray and heavy mist. Imagine yourself diving back into a lead uniform, cold and wet, after having walked naked under the purest August sun. It was like that. Feeling my breath return to my lungs was like swallowing hot sand. My chest rose with a jolt, and the pain I had forgotten in those minutes of glory. It embraced me like an old enemy who never accepted the truce. My fingers gripped the arm of the chair with a strength I didn't know I still possessed. The cold leather, the smell of old wood, and the tick-tock of the watch on my wrist. Everything regained an unbearable weight. I opened my eyes and saw the ceiling of my living room. The same ceiling with that damp stain in the corner. The same world of shadows and blurred outlines. But to me, it was as if someone had erased all the colors from a vibrant painting and left only the pencil sketch. Everything here seems pale, do you understand? Small, as if I were trying to live inside a shoebox after having known the immensity of the desert. My daughter came into the room with a glass of water, worried about my silence. She didn't know I had just crossed the perimeter and returned. She saw only an old man who napped in his chair. I saw the end of all wars. You know, my son, since that day I no longer look at the watch to see how much time I have left. I look at it to remind myself that time is a gift, but it is not the captain. People have a terrible fear of death, don't they? They build bunkers, accumulate metals, and try to bribe eternity with names on bronze plaques. How foolish. If they knew that death is not a canyon of perdition, but only the final frontier to true freedom, they wouldn't live with such fear. That general, that man who laughed at my paranoia, and who was ready to sacrifice me for a success report. I forgave him. At the moment I felt the weight of that light, I realized he is just a lost soldier, trying to command a map he doesn't understand. The anger I carried like a grenade in my chest simply disarmed. There is no room for hate when you discover that the commander of the universe is made of pure love. Now look at me. I'm here, finishing my cold coffee, waiting for the final curfew. But I'm not anxious nor sad. I'm at peace. A peace that this world cannot manufacture in a laboratory or buy at auctions. And that's why I called you here today. Listen well to what this old soldier, who has already seen the other side of the hill, has to say to you. Don't spend your life trying to impress generals who don't know your name. Don't get lost in the colorful maps of this world, seeking glories that rot even before dawn. Your true mission, the only one that really matters, is in the small canyons of your daily life. It's in the hug you give, in the forgiveness you release, in that word of comfort for someone marching alone in the dark. Love, my little one. Love without measure and without fear of looking weak. Love is the only luggage that passes through the customs of eternity without being searched. Everything else, the medals, the titles, the pride of being right, all of that stays behind in the dust of the road. Don't fear the shadows. They are just proof that there is a light shining somewhere nearby. When your radio falls silent and the screens of your world go black, don't panic. Just close your eyes and listen to the rhythm of your own heart. It was tuned by the Creator to mark the time until the final encounter. Live in such a way that when your moment comes to cross the perimeter, you don't arrive as a fugitive, but as a hero returning home with a worn-out uniform. Yes, covered in the dust of the journey for sure, but with a washed soul and ready for the banquet. Go now. Take this peace with you. The sun is already set, but I have never seen so much clarity as I do now. Everything is well. The sector is finally clean.